The Arizona sun bled out across the horizon, painting the jagged mesas in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. For Jedediah "Jed" Stone, it was just the end of another day that had been too long and too hot. He sat on a rock overlooking the small, makeshift camp, the leather of his chaps worn smooth and dark with years of dust and sweat. His dog, a scruffy mutt named Rusty, whose coat was the color of the very earth they sat on, rested his head on Jed's knee, letting out a contented sigh. Below, the lowing of the cattle was a familiar lullaby, and the crackle of the campfire, a welcome promise of coffee and beans. Later, with the chill of the desert night seeping into his bones, Jed nursed a tin cup of bitter coffee. The faces of the other cowboys flickered in the firelight, all of them worn down by the long drive. It was then that Silas, the oldest of the outfit, cleared his throat. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes held a glint of a man who'd seen more than just cattle and plains. "You boys know where we're camped, don't you?" Silas began, his voice a low rasp. "This here is the Ghost Canyon. They say a man's spirit still walks this ground." A few of the younger hands shifted nervously, but Jed just took a slow sip of his coffee. He'd heard 100 such stories around 100 different campfires. They were just words to pass the time, flimsy shields against the vast, crushing silence of the wilderness. "Don't start with your spook stories, Silas," Jed grumbled. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Silas ignored him, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. It was back in '64. The war was still raging, even way out here. A Union cavalry patrol came through, chasing some Rebs who'd been raiding supply lines. There was a lieutenant with them, a young fella from back east. Name was Thorne. They say he was separated from his men during a flash dust storm, the kind that can strip the paint off a wagon and blind a man in seconds. The old man paused, letting the story hang in the air. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant cry of a coyote. "They searched for days," Silas continued. "Found his horse, lame and half dead from thirst, but of Lieutenant Thorne not a trace. No body, no gear, no sign he was ever there, just vanished. Some say the Rebs got him. Others," he lowered his voice, "say the desert itself swallowed him whole. And that on nights when the wind howls just right through this canyon, you can still hear him, whistling for his company, his saber rattling at his side." Jed snorted, tossing the dregs of his coffee into the fire, where they hissed into steam. "And I suppose you've seen this ghost yourself?" "I've heard him," Silas said, his expression deadly serious. "And I know better than to mock what I don't understand. This land, it remembers. It holds on to things." Jed pushed himself to his feet, stretching his stiff back. "The only thing this land holds onto is dust and bones, Silas. A man dies out here, the coyotes find him. That's the only ghost story that's true." He gave a short whistle, and Rusty immediately trotted to his side. As he walked toward his bedroll at the edge of the camp, a sudden gust of wind swept through the canyon. It carried a low, mournful sound, almost like a distant whisper. Jed pulled his collar up, telling himself it was just the wind playing tricks in the rocks. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw Rusty. The dog had stopped, his ears perked, his head cocked, staring out into the impenetrable darkness as if he'd heard something Jed couldn't. The morning sun burned away the ghosts of the night, or so Jed tried to convince himself. The chill that had settled in his bones as he drifted off to sleep was gone, replaced by the familiar, oppressive heat of the Arizona territory. The world was back to normal: dust, sweat, and the endless, lowing sea of longhorns. Silas's story was just that, a story, a way to pass the time and spook the greenhorns. Jed was no greenhorn. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Grit, and gave Rusty a pat on the head. The dog's unease from the night before seemed to have vanished with the dawn, and he trotted alongside Grit, tongue lolling, ready for a day's work. By midday, the herd was moving sluggishly through the oppressive heat. The air shimmered above the cracked earth, and the canyon walls seemed to trap the sun's glare, amplifying it. It was then that a skittish yearling, spooked by a rattlesnake's warning, bolted from the herd. It darted away from the main group, heading deep into a winding, rocky wash choked with mesquite and palo verde. "Dagnabit," Jed muttered, pulling his hat down firmly. He signaled to the trail boss, who gave him a weary nod. This was the job. He nudged Grit into a steady canter, whistling for Rusty to follow. "Come on, boy, let's go fetch our runaway." The calf's tracks were easy enough to follow in the soft sand of the wash. The narrow path twisted and turned, quickly taking them out of sight of the herd. The sounds of the cattle drive faded, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the clatter of Grit's hooves on loose rock and Jed's own breathing. The heat was relentless. Jed felt a bead of sweat trace a path through the dust on his cheek. He was closing in, could hear the calf rustling in a thicket ahead when Rusty suddenly stopped. The dog froze, head cocked, ears perked. Then, ignoring Jed's call, he veered off to the base of a sun-bleached rock outcropping and began to dig with a frantic energy Jed had never seen before. Paws threw dirt and pebbles into the air. "Rusty, leave it. We ain't got time for chassin' gophers," Jed called, his voice tight with annoyance. The dog ignored him completely, whining with a strange mix of excitement and distress as he dug deeper. With a sigh of frustration, Jed dismounted. The calf could wait another minute. He stomped over, ready to pull the dog away by his scruff. "I said, leave it be, you useless." His words died in his throat. This wasn't a gopher hole. Rusty had cleared away enough dirt to reveal something dark and unnatural nestled amongst the rocks. A dull glint of tarnished brass caught the harsh sunlight. Kneeling, Jed pushed the still-digging dog aside gently. His annoyance had evaporated, replaced by a sharp, prickling curiosity. He used his gloved hands to scoop away more of the compacted earth. The object was long and thin. He worked his fingers underneath it, levering it out of the ground where it had lain for God knows how long. It was heavy, far heavier than a branch or a rock. He pulled it free. It was caked in more than a decade of rust and hardened sediment, but as he wiped the dirt from the top end, his breath hitched. The form was unmistakable, an icon of an era he'd only heard about in stories. A wire-wrapped grip, though corroded, was still visible beneath the grime. The distinct, three-branched brass handguard, though green with age, was undeniably that of a model 1860 light cavalry saber. A Union saber. Jed stood slowly, the rusted weapon feeling cold in his hands despite the blistering sun. Silas's campfire voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if he were standing right beside him. A lieutenant of the Union cavalry, vanished right here in '64 during a dust storm. The pragmatic, solid ground beneath his boots suddenly felt a whole lot less certain. The ghost story was no longer just a story. It had a physical, tangible weight, and he was holding it in his hand. The ride back to camp was different. The calf, now securely tied and trotting alongside his horse, was a secondary concern. Jed's focus was on the heavy, awkward weight in his saddlebag, a weight that felt far greater than its physical mass. The setting sun bled purple and orange across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the saguaros that stretched across the canyon floor. The air, usually filled with the familiar sounds of the trail, seemed unnervingly quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He arrived to the smell of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon. The campfire was a lone beacon of warmth and light against the encroaching twilight. The other hands were gathered around it, their talk low and easy. Silas looked up as Jed dismounted, his weathered face etched with concern. "You were gone a while, Jed. Find that stray?" Jed nodded, tying his horse to the picket line before answering. He walked toward the fire, every man's eyes on him. He didn't say a word. He reached into his saddlebag, his hand closing around the cold, rough hilt of the saber. With a heavy thud, he placed it on a flat-topped rock near the fire, the flickering light catching on the pitted and rusted steel. A deep silence fell over the small group. The easy campfire chatter evaporated instantly. Young Finn, who'd been laughing moments before, leaned in, his eyes wide. "What in tarnation is that?" But Silas didn't need to ask. He rose slowly, his old joints creaking, and limped closer to the rock. He didn't touch the saber at first, merely staring at it as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. His gaze traced the gentle curve of the blade, the faint outline of the three-branch guard, the ghost of an inscription on the ricasso, long since devoured by rust. His breath hitched. "Model 1860, he whispered, his voice raspy with an emotion Jed couldn't quite place, awe or maybe sorrow. "Light cavalry, carried by the Union boys." He finally reached out a trembling hand, his calloused fingertips hovering just over the metal. "Sweet Lord, it's real." The legend was no longer just a story to spook greenhorns. It was lying on a rock, cold and solid and undeniably real. The men looked away from the Saber and out into the vast, darkening canyon. The mournful wind from the night before seemed to pick up again, no longer a simple breeze, but a whisper carrying the weight of a century-old secret. Jed watched their faces. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and wonder. He'd spent his life trusting only what he could see and touch, what he could rope and brand. But this was different. This piece of rusted metal was a link to a man's last moments, a forgotten history buried just beneath their feet. "Where'd you find it?" Silas asked, his eyes finally lifting to meet Jed's. "North of here, up against the rock face where the creek bed dries out," Jed said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within him. "Rusty dug it up." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the blade. "He found more than just a stray, Jed. He found a piece of a man's soul." Jed looked back toward the dark maw of the canyon. His pragmatic mind screamed at him to let it be, to move the herd on at sunrise and forget this ever happened. But another part of him, a part he didn't know existed, felt a profound, unsettling sense of duty. He couldn't just leave a story half told. "I'm riding back out there at first light," he announced to the silent group, "just to take another look around." The sun over the Arizona territory in the summer of 1864 was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and baking the very air he breathed. Corporal Samuel Hayes, of the 1st California Volunteer Cavalry, knew he was going to die. His horse, a sturdy bay named Bess, lay a mile back with a feathered shaft in her flank. The Chiricahua were ghosts in this land, and he was a trespasser in a blue uniform, a world away from the green hills of Ohio. His lips were cracked, and the wool of his uniform was a suffocating shroud. The leather dispatch pouch slung across his chest felt heavier than a block of lead, a bitter reminder of his failed mission. He wasn't lost. Worse, he was being herded. For the past hour, he'd caught glimpses, a flicker of movement on a ridge, the glint of sun off something that wasn't rock. They were patient, driving him deeper into the narrow, winding canyon where the walls rose like tombstones. There was no escape. His training screamed at him to find high ground, a defensible position, but every direction was a trap. The silence was the worst part. A heavy, listening quiet broken only by his own ragged breaths and the crunch of his boots on the gravelly wash. His thoughts drifted to his father's farm, the smell of damp earth after a spring rain, the cool promise of a well. He clutched the hot metal of his canteen, shook it, and heard only a pathetic slosh. One mouthful left. He couldn't afford it yet. Duty was a stubborn, unkillable thing. The dispatches had to be protected, had to be destroyed before they were taken. They detailed troop movements, supply routes, information that could get a lot of good men killed. Up ahead, a jumble of boulders and a jagged outcropping of rock offered the slightest hope of cover. It wasn't much, but it was better than dying in the open. With the last of his strength, he scrambled up the loose scree, scraping his hands raw. He wedged himself into a shallow cleft between two large rocks, his back protected. From here, he could see the canyon floor he'd just crossed. It was a kill zone. He took his final sip of water, letting the lukewarm liquid coat his tongue before swallowing. It did little to quench the fire in his throat. He set the empty canteen aside and drew his Colt Army revolver. He checked the cylinder. 4 rounds, not enough. He placed the pistol on the rock beside him. Then, with a slow, deliberate scrape of metal, he drew his Model 1860 Saber. The blade, dulled from use but still serviceable, caught the brutal sunlight. It was an absurd weapon for this fight, a relic of a different kind of war. but it was the symbol of his service, a final piece of himself. He heard it then, a single pebble skittering down the opposite slope. It was a signal. He tightened his grip on the worn leather of the saber's hilt, the metal of the guard pressing into his knuckles. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but his resolve was a sheet of iron. He would not be taken. He would not disgrace the uniform. He was Corporal Samuel Hayes, a soldier of the Union. And here, in this godforsaken canyon, he would make his stand. The pre-dawn air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dust and creosote. Jed was awake long before the cook stirred to life, the rusted saber lying wrapped in an old saddle blanket beside his bedroll. It was more than just a piece of metal now. It was a question that had taken root in his mind, demanding an answer. He moved quietly, saddling his horse under a sky still studded with fading stars. He wasn't surprised to see a silhouette detaching itself from the shadows near the campfire. "Figured you'd be headed back out," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He held the reins of his own horse. "A thing like that, it don't let a man sleep easy." Jed simply nodded. No words were needed. The shared understanding was enough. They rode out together. As the first hint of gray light began to soften the eastern horizon, their progress marked by the soft clop of hooves on the rocky trail. The canyon was different in this light, less menacing, more ancient and solemn. It felt less like a haunted place and more like a silent witness. They reached the rock outcropping just as the sun's rays spilled over the canyon rim, bathing the scene in a stark, golden light. "He would have had his back to these rocks," Jed said, dismounting and surveying the area with a tracker's eye. "Gives him cover from behind. He'd be facing that way." He pointed down the gentle slope toward the dry wash. This time, their search was not a frantic dig, but a slow, methodical examination. They moved in widening circles from the spot where Rusty had found the saber. Jed's gaze scanned the ground, not for anything obvious, but for subtle inconsistencies. A patch of earth that was too loose, a stone that seemed out of place. Silas, meanwhile, moved with a stooped posture, his old eyes trained on the ground for anything that glinted in the morning sun. Nearly an hour passed in silence. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. Jed's boots scuffed against something hard, a sound distinct from the surrounding gravel. He crouched, brushing away the loose dirt with his gloved hand. A small, dark disc emerged. It was corroded and caked with earth, but its shape was unmistakable. He worked it free and rubbed the grime away with his thumb. Underneath the verdigris, the faint but clear impression of an American eagle became visible. "Silas," he called out, his voice quiet but firm. "Over here." Silas shuffled over, peering at the object in Jed's palm. A uniform button, eagle button. That's Union Army, all right, he was here. Right here. The confirmation settled over them with a heavy weight. This was no longer just a legend. It was the final resting place of a soldier. As Jed carefully placed the button in his shirt pocket, Silas gave a soft grunt a few yards away. He was pointing at the ground near the base of a prickly pear cactus. "Look here, Jed." Lying half-buried in the sandy soil was a small, misshapen piece of metal. It was a dull gray, warped and flattened on one side. Jed picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. He recognized the rimmed base immediately. A cartridge, he breathed. He'd seen them in old collections before. A spent one? Silas squinted at it. Spencer carbine, I'd wager, 7-shot. Standard issue for the cavalry by 64. The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. The saber, the button, and now a spent cartridge. This soldier hadn't just gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. He had made a stand. He had fought. The mournful wind Jed had heard suddenly seemed less like a ghost and more like the lingering echo of a desperate battle. The fire crackled, a lonely beacon against the immense, star-dusted dark of the canyon. The saber, the button, and the spent cartridge lay on a worn leather saddlebag between Jed and Silas, illuminated by the flickering light. The other cowboys kept a respectful distance, their usual boisterous talk replaced by a somber quiet. The ghost story had died, and in its place was the far more sobering reality of a man's violent end. "This is as far as the canyon takes us," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He picked up the cartridge, rolling the tarnished brass between his thumb and forefinger. We know he was here, we know he fought, but who he was, what his name was, the rocks won't tell us that. Jed nodded, his gaze fixed on the artifacts. The pragmatic, logical part of his mind, the part that had scoffed at ghosts, was now fully engaged in solving a puzzle. This wasn't about specters. It was about history, about a duty to a man left forgotten in the dust. That story you told, Jed began, about him carrying dispatches. Where would he have been coming from, or going to? Fort Verde, most likely, Silas answered without hesitation. Or maybe even Fort Whipple up by Prescott. That was the territorial capital back then. Any records of troop movements, missing soldiers, they'd be in Prescott if they're anywhere at all. The name hung in the air, Prescott. It was a 2-day ride, a world away from the cattle and the trail. But the thought had taken root. He couldn't just put these items in his saddlebag and forget them. He owed the soldier more than that. The next morning, Jed approached the trail boss, a tough but fair man named Cooper. "Coop, I need to ride into Prescott. Got some personal business that won't wait." Cooper looked from Jed's determined face to the saddlebag where the Saber was carefully wrapped in canvas. He'd heard the story. He simply grunted. "Be back before we move the herd north of the Mogollon." That was all the permission Jed needed. The ride out of Ghost Canyon felt different. The landscape that had seemed menacing just a few days ago now felt like a silent, solemn monument. The sun beat down, the heat shimmering off the rocks as Jed pushed his horse, a steady bay named Buck, toward the north. He rode through arid plains dotted with juniper and sagebrush, the distant mountains a hazy blue line on the horizon. By the end of the second day, the raw wilderness began to yield to civilization. He saw fence lines, a dirt track that widened into a proper road, and finally, the faint outline of rooftops. Prescott was nestled in a valley of ponderosa pines, a stark contrast to the desert he'd just crossed. The town was a living piece of history, its central courthouse plaza surrounded by brick buildings and saloons with swinging doors. Jed felt out of place, a dusty man of the open range stepping into a world of ledgers and law books. He asked for directions to the Historical Society and was pointed toward a stately brick building just off the plaza. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper and wood polish. A woman with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes looked up from behind a large oak desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jed took off his hat, holding it awkwardly in his hands. "Yes, ma'am, I'm hoping to find some information about a Union soldier. He went missing in 1864, out in the canyons south of here." The woman's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's a very specific request. We have territorial archives, military records from Fort Whipple. It's a lot to go through. Do you have a name?" Jed shook his head, a fresh wave of the challenge washing over him. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's what I came here to find." The name on the brittle page seemed to hum with a life of its own, Corporal Samuel Hayes. Jed stared at it, the archivist, a kind woman named Alina, peering over his shoulder. The dispatch from Fort Whipple was brief, listing Hayes as unaccounted for after a scouting mission near the Verde River. It was the confirmation he needed, the first tangible thread connecting a rusted saber to a forgotten man. "Now we have a name, we can check the unit muster rolls," Alina said, her voice filled with the quiet excitement of a puzzle piece clicking into place. "First California Volunteer Cavalry, Company F. They were active all over the territory." For another full day, they sifted through the archives. The work was painstaking, a journey through faded ink and the formal, detached language of military bureaucracy. They found Samuel's enlistment papers, a young man of 20 from Sacramento, a farmhand before the war. They found pay stubs and supply requisitions. But the circumstances of his disappearance remained a mystery, a cold, one-line entry in a ledger. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Alina pulled out a box labeled Personal Correspondence, 1864-65. Inside was a collection of letters, including a packet written by a Captain Elias Vance of Company F. Jed's hands, calloused and rough, felt clumsy as he carefully unfolded a letter addressed to a Mrs. Hayes in California. His voice was low as he read the captain's elegant script aloud. The letter spoke of an ambush. A small patrol, tracking Apache raiders who had stolen army mules, had been caught in a narrow box canyon. "Your son, Samuel," Jed read, his throat tightening, "fought with a valor I have seldom witnessed. He held his ground to allow 2 wounded men to be pulled to safety. In the chaos of our retreat, he was cut off. We returned the next day, but found only signs of a desperate struggle. To our profound sorrow, his body was never recovered." Silence filled the small room, thick with the weight of a century. The ghost story was gone, replaced by a stark, heroic reality. Samuel Hayes wasn't a lost soul wandering the canyon. He was a soldier who had made a final, defiant stand so others could live. The spent cartridge, the saber drawn from its scabbard, it all made sense. He died a hero, alone in the dust. Jed carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Alina. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you for helping me find him." 2 days later, Jed was back in Ghost Canyon. The sun was setting, painting the rock walls in shades of orange and deep purple. Silas was waiting for him, his weathered face full of questions. Jed didn't need many words. He simply told the old cowboy the story of Corporal Hayes. Together, they gathered flat, heavy stones from the canyon floor. At the base of the juniper tree where Rusty had made his discovery, they built a simple, solid cairn. From a piece of weathered lumber in his saddlebags, Jed used his knife to carefully carve an inscription: Corporal Samuel Hayes, 1 SD Cal. Cavalry, 1864. Born a farmer, died a hero. With the last light of day fading, Jed placed the corroded saber and the tarnished uniform button atop the stones. He and Silas stood there for a long moment, their hats held respectfully in their hands. The wind picked up, whispering through the sagebrush. It no longer sounded mournful or strange to Jed. It was just the wind, carrying the quiet story of the land and the brave men who had passed through it. The ghost of the canyon had finally been laid to rest, not by superstition, but by the simple, enduring power of the truth.